So next up then, we've got James Graham. He's the Divisional CEO, Digital and Energy Services at Equans. He's going to talk about how using AI and IoT will transform the world of energy and services.
I'm going to try and make this presentation quite interesting. I appreciate you've probably seen a lot of slides this afternoon. And I've heard some of my colleagues already, so I think there's some similarities, there are probably some common messages and perhaps some differences. So before I talk to you about how I think AI and IoT is going to transform how we deliver services, I wanted to run through a little bit of context and why I think some of those changes are so powerful and why they're going to happen so quickly and that they're here to stay. So the first one of those things I want to talk about is, I guess, the race for AI and supremacy. So you may have heard lots about this morning. It wasn't here, so I can't say. But clearly, global powers around the world are fighting for a slice of artificial intelligence and computing power. We saw that in the UK in November last year with a slightly odd combination of Rishi Sunak and Elon Musk meeting. You can see that several sound bites came out of that conference all about the fact that actually there'll be no jobs. And I think Elon even said that AI would be a good friend for his children. Whether you believe that or not, there is clearly a rapid level of automation coming, and there is clearly a huge element of socioeconomic and economic growth associated with artificial intelligence. Some of the context behind that, I suppose, is the power of big tech. This slide is shamelessly stolen from one of my colleagues, but I quite like it because it really puts into context just the level of power and scale that technology companies have. If you look on the chart on the table on the left-hand side, you can see the nominal GDP of the top 10 countries, and Apple in its own right, a market cap of 2.15 billion, sits just outside the G7. Combine those two together and you've got a scale of an organisation that sits inside the top four. And you think about where that power is centred, where that economic power is centred, it's huge. The table on the top right shows you how some of our social media platforms reach a number of individuals across the world. So Facebook, YouTube and WhatsApp with the combined audience reach of just over 7 billion. Pale that to the population of China and India. The influence is huge. And therefore the power of technology and the market growth that you see on the bottom right exponentially outperforming every other sector. And so if you combine, you can suddenly see why global powers are suddenly fighting for that slice of artificial intelligence and technology to drive forward their economies. The next context is, I suppose, the relative benefit of that technology, and I quite like this slide taken from an investment deck online. I'm not sure how realistic it is, but if you take the purple bar on the right-hand side, people are predicting, or this particular research group predicting that AI will add 120% cumulative increase in real GDP. Compare that to the steam engine at just over 35%, and information technology, so the computer boom in the late 90s. So the impact is going to be huge. So we can see this massive race for technology, that centering of power in those technology companies, influencing the scale and the pace of development across the globe. I think this next slide, again, there'll have been lots of discussion about post-COVID working trends, and it feels a bit odd to be talking about post-COVID working trends, but they're still a thing. And I think my colleague from BP was saying, actually, they'd seen a relatively strong return to the office. I think some data, it depends where you look, shows that actually we're still seeing hybrid working here to stay. This graph on the left-hand side shows you, I think it was a sample of about 119 offices from the Association of Workplace Advisors. That 70% of office in the middle of July 23 had less than 40% occupancy. And the interesting fact on that is it is having an impact clearly on demand for office space. So for us in the workplace environment means that demand for the office space is reducing. There is requirement for efficiency, and I'm sure that's been touched on this morning, but ultimately we're having to do more with less. Our customers are having to do more with less. So how we interact and the cost and efficiency of running a building is incredibly important. The next context really, and I want to talk about, is the climate. And I suppose really the context of this is net zero is no longer enough. In 2019, we came out with legislation to achieve net zero by 2050. One of the first countries or major countries to have that in legislation, and we all went off, we focused on how we can decarbonise our energy supply, so our upstream energy, solar, wind, other forms of renewables. Then along came Putin, the invasion of Ukraine, and suddenly that switched to energy security, and suddenly we were focused on where our energy comes from, how viable is it, how much does it cost, and we suddenly focused on those increased energy bills. And then what we're starting to see now is adaptation. So the physical impacts of climate change on the built environment and the workplace are massive. The text at the top of that slide just shows you a bit of a snippet from some of the news feeds that we've had over the last few months. But January was the warmest January on record globally, and it was the 8th month in a row that record temperatures were set. It means that now, for the last 12 months, we're 1.52 degrees above the pre-industrial average. So the impacts of climate change are now real, and here it's not about actually net zero, it's about how we mitigate the change in the environment. And again, this slide just puts that into a bit of context. So this shows you the Central England temperatures all the way up to 2100. The lines I think are important to look at on this slide are the red line, which is a scenario called RCP 8.5, which is a high emission scenario. So that assumes that we do nothing, we continue to grow. The blue line is limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, so the Paris Accord. So that says that if we were to meet the Paris Accord at 1.5 degrees, we would still see that increase in global temperatures. And I think it's probably commonly accepted by everyone that we're not going to achieve that blue line. So the reality is we're going to be somewhere between the blue and the red line. So that's a pretty scary prospect, and what that means for our buildings and our workplaces and for us as people. So the context of the two things I want to talk about are really that countries are fighting for the slice of the AI revolution. It's to protect our future economic status and growth and status in a global stage. Big tech is bringing that technological change at a pace and scale that we just haven't seen before. The impacts are going to be massive, and no one sat in this room can really tell you what they're going to be in 20, 30 years' time. And the way that we interact with work in the physical environment has changed, whether that is through post-COVID hybrid working or whether that is through technology, but that's a permanent change that I think is going to increase. And finally, net zero is no longer enough, and our climate is already changing, as we showed you on the last graph. So we have to take some action. All those things feed into what the future workplace looks like. So I'm afraid this slide does look a bit doom-laden, but this is actually London 2022 heat wave, temperature about 40 degrees. This is where parts of London started to spontaneously combust with heathland, and I think it was, for the London Fire Brigade, or all fire brigade across the UK, the busiest day in peacetime. And that was in summer 2022, and we're going to start to see some increasing temperatures as we go forward. But those physical impacts of climate change impact our built environment. And across the top of this slide, you've got kind of 5 key areas. All of those are fairly obvious to us, but the impacts are pretty important. When it comes to workplaces, we all know that people perform better in a comfortable environment. Translate that down to areas where you've got vulnerable people, be that schools, hospitals. We know that children perform better and exam results are impacted when classrooms are above 25 degrees. And those people that are living in social housing or in prisons are universally affected to a greater level by that overheating. Flash flooding, a major issue now across the UK. Zurich believe that about 2/5 of London businesses are at risk of flash flooding. And then you've got huge increases in the number of storms, and as I kind of said on the prior slide with the picture, a 400% increase in wildfires. So what does that really mean for us? Well, the government is going to have to start to think about the regulation that surrounds that. And for those of us in workplaces, we're going to have to think about how we respond to that. There's litigation risk. The principle we're starting to see in Europe is that businesses, employers, building owners, asset owners know the risk of climate change. And if they don't take action, are they then responsible for the impacts on the population and their workers? And thirdly, the big one, I suppose, for people in charge of budgets is insurance risk. Insurance premiums are forecast to rise by 40%. And that is already against the backdrop of an office environment where we know demand is falling and budgets are constrained. So we have to start to ask ourselves whether are our buildings, our operations and our people climate safe? And I guess what does that mean? So we've thought at Equans a little bit about how we can use some technology and some traditional methods to start to address some of this problem. So we're not going to fix the changing climate, but I think it's something that's going to be the top of a lot of workplace coordinators, building and asset owners' minds over the next few years. This photo is from last, I think, November time. We had that many named storms last year, as you chat, but it's Storm Babbitt, and it's a Land Rover dealership in Derbyshire. Never flooded before, but you can see quite a new building. Quite an expensive problem if you've just ordered your Range Rover and wanted it in time for Christmas. And you can see that actually what you've got there is a multi-million-pound problem for the building owner. Workplace that can't be used, business interrupted, loads of stock lost. There's not a lot you can do about that, but you can start to think about how you can defend against it. There's technology out there today, and so one of the things that we've started to do is to do that climate risk consulting analysis, so to understand down to a range of about 20 metres using data where buildings are exposed to flash flood risk, storm risk, damage risk. So you can actually start to ascertain, well, which bits of your estate are important, which bits are going to be impacted the most by the changing climate, and what do you need to do to move your operations or change the way you operate your buildings. Then you've got the traditional bit of our businesses, which is where we're kind of all in this space used to physical changes to buildings, so flood defences, tanking lift shafts, those things that mean that buildings are more resilient to the changing climate. And then there's the way we use technology around that. So by starting to use IoT data and sensors that we deploy around a building, as well as information from Met Office, Environment Agency, river level data, you can start to predict and analyse when some of these things and these events are going to occur. And this is all about changing a catastrophic event into a more manageable event, because we can't stop the climate. But in terms of the future workplace, we're going to have to be thinking about how we start to have location-specific risk analysis so we understand the impact on our buildings, how we start to take measures to protect our buildings from those, how we then use data to make sure it's predictive and that we can start to move stock. And if you think in the example of that Land Rover garage, if you'd have known that was coming, if you'd been looking at your river data, you knew your site was exposed, you'd have moved your stock and you'd have reduced the impact on your business. And that comes back to what we do in terms of helping mitigate and plan that response. And all of those things mean that you create an environment where you have a reduced likelihood and value of an insurance claim, but more importantly, you've got enhanced resilience of your business and your customers, so your workplace can keep operating. And this is something that I think is going to become core to what we deliver and what we all seem to be asking ourselves when we're looking at our workplaces and where we locate our people and operations. So that was the first thing I wanted to talk about. I guess the second one is more technology focused, and my son insisted that I'd managed to get Pokemon into my presentation. I thought it was the first time I've been able to do it in a year. Augmented reality, very exciting, but I actually think Pokemon Go was probably the most widely used application of AR reality, early adoption, and certainly I've learned how to use it thanks to my son, although he has started to grow out of it, which is beneficial. But where I'm going with this is that physical presence is no longer required for tasks. We know that even if policy is driving people back to the office, that physical interaction is now happening online. And the graph on the left shows you 253% use in Teams, Skype and Google Meets. None of that stuff surprises anyone. What surprises me is how happy the people are, though, on that photograph. I don't think I've looked that happy on a Teams call for a long time. But augmented reality is starting to bring some of that physical interaction into the online space. Tools like Microsoft Mesh mean that actually you're starting to replace those water cooler moments. Everyone said, well, we need to go back to the office because when we're in the office we have those personal connections, those moments where we're talking to each other. But I don't think it's that far away from technology replacing some of that interaction and us using AR to be able to interact in a much more intelligent way. The graph on the left just shows you the increase in AR devices and how they're used and deployed, in the UK. Predicted, I have to squint, sorry at my slide, but a large number of devices, forecast from 2024. And that's bringing what we already really know is happening, and I'm sure this slide or similar slides have been shared this morning, which is automation of tasks is increasing the reduction of physical presence and, in certain cases, jobs. And that means that in the way in which we're managing our workplaces, we need to think about changing the way we deliver our services, to change the way we operate. You can see on this graph, the bottom half, some of those more repetitive tasks around process, administration, elementary, are all those that are more impacted from job losses through automation, whereas those more managerial and professional roles you can see growing throughout the increase in AI. So that means that we've got to think about the physical workplace in a very different way, and we don't think about the physical workplace necessarily as a building and bricks and blocks anymore. It's about making those assets that we love that operate a building, that improve experience of employees and workers digital. And the way we deliver those services has already changed. I think a lot of us in this space are used to seeing and communicating with our buildings in a digital way, whether that's at home through Hive apps on our phone, or it's controlling televisions and other things remotely. The same happens in our buildings, and using smarter platforms to look at compliance, to look at data-driven solutions. We're starting to automate lots of maintenance tasks in our buildings, and we're starting to enhance service delivery because automation removes manual error. That means that we can do things more reliably, more accurately, more regularly, more of the time. And that means that the cost to a building user, and it's that backdrop of automation, those wider pressures on budgets and cost of office space become lessened. Another really good example for us is things like the remote monitoring of systems. So using a bureau service in order to start to look at how you monitor your energy efficiency, your boilers, your pumps and your meters, means that actually we've working across a number of sites, including MOD, reduced the number of engineers we send out to fix a piece of kit by 60%. So you don't have to physically send someone in a van to a site to fix a piece of kit. We can also then optimise that plant for energy efficiency to make sure that actually it's consuming the least amount of energy and operating as efficiently as it can do. And therefore you're saving carbon and energy in terms of both actually sending someone physically to site, but the energy consumption of the building, and you're giving yourself kind of really clear and assured performance that your building is operating in the most efficient way that it can do. And I was asked then to kind of talk a little bit about some of the AI and IoT that we've got in action. And I think lots of us in this space where we're looking at AI-driven projects and starting to really focus on how we can detect the performance of buildings and identify faults in advance. So using data collation from all of our assets across our estate to go, well, what's the most efficient way of operating that building? How can we ensure that there is comfort and user experience? How can we ensure that we're optimising energy and protecting those buildings from climate change? That means that we're reducing those manual interventions and that therefore we are using technology to increase uptime and resilience. So, a couple of thoughts to conclude on. I think kind of what does that mean really for the future of the workplace in the long term? Well, I do think hybrid and remote working is going to be the norm. I don't think we're going to see a return. I don't think we can attract talent if we have people in the office 5 days a week. We are going to see automation and augmentation of tasks. I think that AR piece is going to be a huge part of change the way in which you work over the next 10 years. That leads to a question of, well, what is the workplace of the future? Well, we know there's reduced space demand, and we therefore know that we need to create efficiency in the way we operate those buildings, and that technology has a huge part in doing that. Another area that I haven't really touched on, but skills is a huge challenge. I think one of my colleagues mentioned it in one of the earlier presentations. We're partnering with a company called Multiverse in order to upskill a huge number of our employees in data and digital skill sets, because we recognise that to operate in this automated AR world, you need a very different skill set to what we have today. And as an organisation, we've all got a part to play in upskilling our employees. But that means that actually I think the built estate that we have today, the offices we operate in, probably won't be used in the same way that they are in the future. And I was thinking, well, what does the workplace of the future look like? And I couldn't really do much better than thinking about what the workplaces of the past look like today. And it's hard to imagine that our grandfathers or fathers were thinking about moving into a one-bedroom flat in their former office and paying £1.2 million for the privilege. So the short answer is I don't know what the workplace of the future looks like, but I do know that augmented reality, automation and the need to protect against the physical impacts of climate change play a huge part in what we have to do in managing that workplace of the future. Thank you.